Blake Hudson stepped out of his sports car with the kind of confidence that came naturally to someone who had always had everything handed to him. At 28, he was the heir to one of the country's largest automotive dynasties, known for his luxurious lifestyle and his skill with high-performance cars. The event that evening, a motorcycle race sponsored by Hudson Motors, was just another opportunity to keep up appearances and impress investors. The biker bar next to the circuit was buzzing with people eager for the adrenaline rush and the deafening roar of engines. As Blake walked in, he noticed the stark contrast between this gritty setting and the glamorous parties he was used to attending. Here, the scent of leather and grease mixed with the loud chatter. He barely had time to settle into a corner before he noticed a woman at the bar, laughing with the other staff. Ruby Evans was unlike anyone else there. With curly brown hair that cascaded down her shoulders and a captivating smile, she had a commanding presence. She wore a worn-out t-shirt and oil-stained jeans, looking every bit like someone who belonged, someone who knew the value of hard work and didn't mind getting her hands dirty. When Blake's and Ruby's eyes met, there was a moment of silent recognition. It wasn't common for Blake to be intrigued by someone from such a different world, but there was something about her that sparked his curiosity. Determined to learn more about the woman behind the grease and leather, he made his way over to the bar and ordered a beer. "First time here?" Ruby asked, handing him the bottle with a playful smile. "Yeah, but I'm liking what I see," Blake replied, returning the smile. "Is this the kind of place where you learn about bikes?" She chuckled at his comment, picking up on the curiosity in his tone. "You don't learn about bikes in a bar," Ruby said, leaning in slightly as if sharing a secret. "You learn in the garage. I could show you a thing or two if you're really interested." Her response caught Blake off guard. There was a genuine confidence in her voice, something that made him want to take on the challenge. When the race ended and the bar started to empty, Ruby led him to the small workshop behind the bar, where she kept a few bikes and tools. "So, what do you know about fixing a bike?" she asked, handing him a wrench. Blake hesitated for a moment, then admitted, "Not as much as I probably should." Ruby smirked and motioned for him to follow her to one of the motorcycles. "Well, you're in luck. I'm feeling generous tonight." She showed him how to tighten a few bolts and talked him through the basics of engine maintenance. As she spoke, Blake found himself genuinely interested, not just in the mechanics of the bike but in the way she talked about it. There was a passion in her voice that was hard to ignore. It was clear that working on motorcycles wasn't just a job for her, it was something she truly loved. As they worked, the conversation flowed naturally. Ruby shared stories about how she had learned to fix bikes from her late father, who used to run a small garage in town. Blake, in turn, spoke about his family's legacy in the automotive industry, though he left out the parts about private jets and penthouses. There was no need to rub in the fact that their lives were worlds apart. As the night wore on, Blake found himself drawn not just to Ruby's skills, but to her resilience and the life she had carved out for herself despite the odds. When she finally set down her tools, she gave him a look that was equal parts challenging and amused. "So, Mr. Hudson, think you could get used to working with your hands?" she asked. Blake shrugged, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think I could manage." They exchanged numbers before he left, a promise to meet again lingering in the air. For Blake, it was an unexpected but welcome escape from the pressures of his world. For Ruby, it was just another night at the bar, with a little more intrigue than usual. A few weeks had passed since that night at the bar, and Blake hadn't been able to get Ruby out of his mind. Their conversation replayed in his thoughts, especially the way she spoke about her life and her work with a kind of passion he seldom encountered in his own circles. He found himself looking for excuses to stop by the biker bar, but his busy schedule kept him tied up with the responsibilities that came with being the face of Hudson Motors. Then, out of the blue, he received a text from Ruby. It was short and to the point, asking if they could meet up. The straightforwardness of her message piqued his curiosity. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral location away from the noise and chaos of the bar. When Blake arrived, he spotted Ruby sitting at a table by the window, staring out with a distant expression. As he approached, she glanced up, and the look on her face was enough to tell him that this wasn't a social call. "Hey, Ruby. What's going on?" Blake asked, sitting down across from her. She took a deep breath, her fingers tapping nervously on the side of her cup. "I'm just going to come right out and say it," she began. "I'm pregnant, Blake. And before you say anything, yes, it's yours." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Blake felt the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, struggling to process the situation. Of all the outcomes he had considered when he saw her text, this was not one of them. "How? I mean, are you sure?" he stammered, his voice betraying his shock. Ruby's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied, her tone firm. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't." Blake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to think. I didn't expect this. I mean, this isn't exactly what either of us planned." "No kidding," Ruby replied dryly, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. She had braced herself for his reaction, but seeing it unfold in real time felt different, harsher. A heavy silence hung between them for several moments. Blake's thoughts were a chaotic swirl of questions, most of which centered on how this would impact his life. The company, his reputation, the press, they were all complications he had no desire to deal with. "I'm not trying to force anything on you," Ruby continued, breaking the silence. "I just thought you had a right to know. I'm planning to keep the baby, but I'm not asking you for anything. I can do this on my own." Her words took him by surprise. He hadn't expected her to say that she didn't want anything from him. But there was a part of him that felt uneasy, almost guilty, as if this situation was slipping through his fingers without him having any control over it. "Look, Ruby," he said cautiously, "I'm not saying I don't want to be involved, but we have to be realistic. There are a lot of things to consider here. Maybe it would be better if we didn't go through with this." The suggestion hung in the air like a bitter cloud, and the look on Ruby's face instantly turned to one of disbelief and anger. "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really think it's that simple? Just take care of it and move on like nothing happened? That's not going to work for me, Blake. This isn't some inconvenience that you can pay to make disappear." Blake could feel the tension rising, but he wasn't sure how to diffuse it. His instinct was to avoid complications, to find an easy solution and move on, just as he had always done with other problems in his life. But this wasn't a business deal. It was real, and it was messy, and there were no straightforward answers. "I'm just trying to be practical here," he insisted, though his words felt hollow even to himself. "You don't have to do this alone, Ruby. I can help, financially, I mean." She scoffed, shaking her head as she rose from the table. "You really don't get it, do you? I don't need your money, and I don't need you to tell me what's practical. I'm going to have this baby, with or without your involvement." Before Blake could respond, she grabbed her bag and walked out, leaving him sitting there, staring at the half-empty coffee cup she'd left behind. He felt a mix of frustration and helplessness as he watched her go, unsure of what to do next. The weeks that followed were a blur for Blake. He threw himself into his work, trying to bury the situation under layers of meetings and projects. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the thought of Ruby and the unborn child lingered in the back of his mind. It was an itch he couldn't quite scratch, a constant reminder that some things in life couldn't be controlled or managed with a checkbook. Meanwhile, Ruby was facing the reality of her decision head-on. She continued to work at the bar while picking up odd jobs fixing motorcycles whenever she could. As the pregnancy progressed, the physical toll began to show, but she refused to let it slow her down. She had always been fiercely independent, and this was no different. It wasn't long before word began to spread about her pregnancy. Some people at the bar whispered behind her back, speculating about who the father was and making assumptions about her motives. She did her best to ignore them, but the sting of their judgment cut deeper than she cared to admit. Ruby had always been a fighter. She grew up in a world where nothing was ever handed to her, where every inch of progress had to be earned through hard work and perseverance. Now, as she faced the challenges of being a single, pregnant woman, those qualities became more crucial than ever. The gossip at the bar didn't stop. Whispers about her pregnancy and speculations about the father were commonplace, and Ruby was sure some people knew more than they let on. There were the inevitable judgments, assumptions that she was looking for a way out, that she was trying to trap some poor guy into taking responsibility. But Ruby knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. She wasn't asking for anyone's help, not Blake's, and certainly not anyone else's. Despite her defiant attitude, the reality of her situation was undeniable. The pregnancy took its toll, and the long shifts at the bar, combined with the occasional motorcycle repair job, became increasingly exhausting. Her body ached in ways she hadn't anticipated, and there were days when getting out of bed felt like an insurmountable task. But she kept pushing through, telling herself that she had no other choice. The bills were piling up. The extra expenses for prenatal care and basic necessities meant that money was tighter than ever, and Ruby found herself cutting back wherever she could. She saved every penny she earned, knowing that once the baby arrived, her workload would inevitably slow down. She needed to prepare, to make sure she and her child would be okay on their own. But despite all her efforts, there were moments of doubt, fleeting thoughts that maybe, just maybe, she had been too proud when she walked away from Blake's offer. It wasn't that she regretted choosing to have the baby, but there were times when she wondered if it would have been better to accept some kind of financial support, even if just to get through the hardest months. It was a thought she quickly pushed away, though, every time it crept up. She wasn't about to compromise her independence or her principles, even for the sake of convenience. One evening, after another grueling shift, Ruby was closing up the bar when her boss, Chuck, pulled her aside. Chuck was a gruff, middle-aged man with a rough-around-the-edges demeanor, but he had always been fair with Ruby. "Ruby, you sure you're okay?" he asked, eyeing her with concern. "You've been looking a bit worn out lately." "I'm fine, Chuck," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." He grunted, unconvinced. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but if you ever need some time off, or anything, just let me know. Don't push yourself too hard, all right?" Ruby appreciated the gesture, even though she knew she couldn't afford to take time off. "Thanks, Chuck. I'll be okay," she said, and she hoped it sounded convincing. As the weeks wore on, Ruby's determination didn't waver, but the physical demands of pregnancy did. She found herself struggling with tasks that used to be routine. Lifting heavy crates, moving supplies, even standing for long periods became increasingly difficult. Still, she didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't solve anything, and there was no room for weakness in the life she was building. Meanwhile, Blake was grappling with his own inner turmoil. On the surface, his life continued as it always had: meetings, events, and the ceaseless grind of managing Hudson Motors. But beneath that polished exterior, he was haunted by thoughts of Ruby and the unborn child he had all but turned his back on. He had tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision, that staying out of her life was what she wanted. Yet, every time he saw a young family or overheard a colleague talking about their children, a pang of regret would strike. It didn't help that rumors about Ruby's pregnancy had started circulating in his social circles. No one knew for certain who the father was, but a few people hinted at the possibility of Blake's involvement, given his recent, albeit brief, connection to her. At first, he tried to dismiss the rumors as idle gossip, but as they persisted, it became harder to ignore. One day, Blake found himself standing outside the biker bar where he and Ruby had first met. He didn't know what he was doing there or what he hoped to accomplish, but something inside him had brought him back to that place. He didn't go inside, though. Instead, he just stood there for a while, watching the comings and goings of the patrons, wondering what Ruby was doing at that exact moment. Ruby's pregnancy reached the late stages, and with it came a new set of challenges. She struggled to keep up with the demands of work, and even her side gigs repairing motorcycles had to be scaled back. One evening, as she worked on a particularly stubborn engine, her body gave out, and she felt a sharp pain that shot through her lower back. She doubled over, clutching her belly, and for the first time, a wave of fear washed over her. She sat down, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't have the luxury of breaking down now, there was no one to come to her rescue. But that incident was a wake-up call. She had to start thinking not just about surviving until the baby arrived, but about how she would manage afterward. The thought of raising a child alone was daunting, but she wasn't about to let that fear control her. With the little energy she had left, Ruby made the difficult decision to cut back on her hours at the bar. She couldn't afford to risk her health or that of her baby any further. Chuck understood, but there was a part of Ruby that hated admitting she needed to slow down. She had always prided herself on being able to handle anything, and now she was being forced to acknowledge that she couldn't do it all. As she prepared for the arrival of her child, Ruby found herself thinking about Blake more often than she cared to admit. She wondered if he ever thought about her, or if he was relieved that she had made it clear she didn't need his help. But no matter how many times his name crossed her mind, she always came back to the same conclusion: this was her life to live, her fight to fight. Ruby was determined to prove, to herself and to the world, that she could do this on her own. 5 years had come and gone, and in that time, Ruby had managed to build a life for herself and her son, Jake. She had opened her own motorcycle repair shop, Ruby's Garage, which had quickly gained a reputation for quality work and fair prices. Her regular customers appreciated her no-nonsense attitude and her knack for fixing even the most temperamental engines. Ruby had carved out a place for herself in the community, and Jake had become a familiar face around the shop, always eager to help his mom with small tasks. Jake was a lively, curious boy with the same brown curls as his mother and a natural affinity for anything with wheels. Even at his young age, he had already developed a love for motorcycles, mimicking Ruby's movements as she worked on bikes. He would hand her tools and ask endless questions about how things worked, his eyes lighting up every time she explained the mechanics of an engine. Ruby's Garage had become more than just a business, it was a safe haven for her and Jake. It was where she had found strength during the difficult times, where she had poured all her energy into building a future. There were days when the work was grueling and the hours long, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. Every wrench she turned and every bike she repaired was a step toward proving to herself that she could do this, on her own terms. As much as she had tried to put the past behind her, there were moments when Ruby still thought about Blake. She wondered what he was doing now, whether he had ever looked back on their brief, tumultuous connection with any sense of regret. But those thoughts were rare and fleeting, quickly dismissed whenever Jake tugged on her sleeve to ask for help or to show her something new he'd learned. She had moved on from Blake Hudson, or at least, that was what she told herself. Meanwhile, Blake's life had taken a different turn. The past 5 years had not been kind to him. Hudson Motors, once a symbol of automotive excellence, had faced a series of setbacks that threatened to crumble the company's legacy. A bad investment in a failing electric car startup had cost millions, and the ensuing scandal involving faulty safety features had done irreparable damage to the company's reputation. Blake had spent the past few years firefighting one crisis after another, desperately trying to keep the business afloat while fending off board members who questioned his leadership. It was a far cry from the life he had once known. The luxury, the parties, and the carefree attitude were long gone, replaced by sleepless nights and a nagging sense of doubt. He couldn't help but feel that somewhere along the way, he had lost his way. And as he struggled to find his footing in the corporate world, there was a lingering thought that kept surfacing, a regret that perhaps he had turned his back on something important. Blake had thought about Ruby more times than he cared to admit. He wondered how she was doing, what had become of the child they never really talked about. It was one of those thoughts that he kept buried, too afraid to confront the reality of his choices. But life had a way of circling back to the things we leave unresolved. One afternoon, while out for a ride to clear his mind, Blake's motorcycle started making a strange noise. He pulled over, checking the engine but couldn't quite diagnose the issue. As he scrolled through his phone looking for a nearby garage, a familiar name appeared on the list: Ruby's Garage. Blake's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea if it was the same Ruby or just a coincidence, but curiosity, and perhaps a touch of fate, drew him toward the small shop. When he arrived, he saw a modest building with the sign Ruby's Garage painted in bold letters across the front. There were a few bikes parked outside, and the sound of a child's laughter drifted through the open garage doors. As he stepped closer, Blake caught sight of a little boy, about 5 years old, handing a wrench to a woman crouched by a motorcycle. It didn't take long for him to recognize the familiar curve of her shoulders and the wild brown curls escaping from under her cap. It was Ruby, and the boy was unmistakably his son. Blake's breath caught in his throat as he watched them together. There was a natural ease in the way they moved, a rhythm that spoke of a life spent side by side. For a moment, he was paralyzed, unsure of whether he should walk away or step forward. But then Jake noticed him, staring curiously at the stranger standing by the entrance. "Mom, there's a man here," Jake called out, pointing at Blake. Ruby straightened up, wiping her hands on a rag before turning to face the unexpected visitor. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Blake standing there, a mixture of surprise and something else flashing across her face, something she quickly masked. "Blake," she said, her voice steady but with an edge. "What are you doing here?" Blake stood there, momentarily at a loss for words. Seeing Ruby again, after all these years, stirred up feelings he hadn't expected. And then there was the boy, Jake, standing beside her with wide eyes, looking up at him with a mix of curiosity and innocence. Blake's gaze shifted from Ruby to the child, and the weight of the situation hit him with full force. "I didn't know this was your place," Blake finally said, his voice strained. "I was having some trouble with my bike and saw the name, figured I'd check it out." Ruby's expression remained guarded as she glanced at the motorcycle parked outside. "Well, you found the right place," she replied, her tone neutral. "What seems to be the problem?" Blake took a small step closer, noticing how Ruby kept a protective arm around Jake's shoulders. He couldn't help but stare at the boy, who was unmistakably his son. There was no denying the resemblance, from the dark hair to the shape of his eyes. It felt strange and overwhelming to realize he was looking at a child he had never met, a child he had chosen to walk away from. "The engine's making a strange noise," Blake said, forcing his attention back to Ruby. "I can't figure out what's causing it. Thought you could take a look." Ruby nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read his intentions. "I'll have a look," she replied, turning toward Jake. "Jake, go grab my toolbox, will you?" The boy dashed off eagerly, leaving Blake and Ruby standing in an awkward silence. When Ruby finally spoke, her voice was low and calm. "So, you're just passing through?" she asked. "Or did you come here looking for something?" Blake hesitated, unsure how to explain himself. "I didn't plan this," he said slowly. "But now that I'm here, I guess I'd like to talk. To catch up." Ruby let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You want to catch up? After 5 years?" There was a bite to her words, but Blake could hear the hurt beneath them. "I thought you made it clear that you didn't want anything to do with us." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but before he could find the right words, Jake returned with the toolbox, his small face flushed with excitement. "Here, Mom," he said, setting the tools down next to the motorcycle. "Thanks, kiddo," Ruby said, giving her son a quick smile before crouching down beside the bike. She began examining the engine, her hands moving expertly over the parts. "This might take a while," she said to Blake without looking up. "You're welcome to wait inside, if you want." Blake took a seat on one of the old chairs in the small waiting area, the atmosphere filled with the scent of motor oil and rubber. He couldn't take his eyes off Jake, who had wandered over to a corner where he was tinkering with a small toy motorcycle. It was a simple activity, but Blake could see the concentration in the boy's face, a look that reminded him of Ruby's focus whenever she worked. As he watched Jake play, a pang of guilt welled up inside him. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He had a son he had never known, who had grown up without him. Blake didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Part of him wanted to reach out, to say something to the boy, but he didn't know where to start. After what felt like an eternity, Ruby emerged from the garage, wiping her hands on a rag. "It's the timing chain," she said, meeting Blake's gaze. "It needs to be replaced." I can do it, but it'll take a few hours. Do whatever you need to do, Blake replied, standing up. I'll wait. Ruby nodded and returned to the workshop, leaving Blake in the waiting area once more. This time, Jake came over and sat on a stool nearby, glancing at Blake with the unabashed curiosity of a child. Are you a friend of my mom's? Jake asked. Blake felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure how to answer. We used to know each other, he said carefully. A long time ago. Oh, Jake replied, nodding as if that answer made perfect sense. Do you like motorcycles? Blake managed a small smile. Yeah, I do. Your mom is really good at fixing them. Jake's eyes lit up with pride. She taught me a lot about bikes. I help her sometimes. He paused, tilting his head as he looked at Blake. Do you have kids? The question caught Blake off guard, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. He felt the weight of everything he had missed out on pressing down on him. No, he said quietly. No, I don't. Jake nodded again, as if he hadn't expected any other answer. That's okay, he said, returning to his toy bike. Blake watched him for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the garage, where Ruby was working on his motorcycle. He knew he couldn't just walk away this time, not now that he had seen what was at stake. He had come here by chance, but maybe there was a reason for it. Maybe this was his chance to make things right. After a few hours, Ruby emerged again, this time with a slight look of satisfaction on her face. It's done, she said, wiping her hands on a rag. It should run smoothly now. Blake stood up and reached for his wallet. How much do I owe you? Ruby shook her head. Don't worry about it. Consider it a favor, for old time's sake. Ruby, I don't want. I said don't worry about it, she interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. Just take care of yourself, Blake. As he walked out of the garage, Blake felt the familiar sting of regret. He hadn't known what to say to Ruby, and he hadn't known how to speak to Jake. But as he mounted his repaired motorcycle, one thing became clear: he couldn't just leave things as they were. He had to find a way to be a part of his son's life, even if it took time to rebuild what he had once let slip away. As he rode away from the shop, he glanced back one last time, catching a glimpse of Ruby watching him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. It wasn't the end of the story, Blake realized. It was just the beginning. Blake couldn't get Ruby and Jake out of his mind. The encounter at Ruby's garage had stirred something inside him, an undeniable need to be a part of his son's life. It wasn't just guilt, it was a genuine desire to make amends and, if possible, to build a relationship with Jake. He knew it wouldn't be easy. After all, he had walked away when Ruby needed him most, and now he was asking for a second chance that he wasn't sure he deserved. The next weekend, Blake found himself pulling up to Ruby's garage again, this time with no excuses about a broken motorcycle. As he stepped out of his car, he saw Ruby outside, sorting through some tools. Her expression turned worry when she noticed him approaching. "What are you doing here, Blake?" she asked, a touch of exasperation in her voice. "If your bike needs more work, I'd suggest finding a new mechanic. I'm not in the business of fixing the same problem twice." Blake held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here about the bike," he said, his tone calm but sincere. I want to talk. About Jake." Ruby's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" Blake took a deep breath. "I know I haven't been there. And I don't expect you to forgive me just because I showed up again. But I'd like to try to be a part of his life. I'd like to get to know him, if you'll let me." Ruby's expression softened just a fraction, but there was still skepticism in her gaze. "And why now, Blake?" she asked. "What changed?" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Honestly, I don't have a good answer for that," he admitted. "I guess seeing him, it just made me realize how much I've missed out on. And I don't want to miss out any longer." Ruby considered him for a moment, then sighed. "I'm not going to just let you waltz into his life and play dad all of a sudden," she said. "You're a stranger to him, Blake. And to be honest, you're not much more than that to me at this point." "I understand," Blake replied, nodding. "I'm not asking for everything to change overnight. I just want to start small. Maybe spend some time with him, get to know him better. I'll take it at whatever pace you think is best." Ruby looked conflicted. There was a part of her that didn't want to let Blake in. He had walked away once, and she wasn't sure she could trust him not to do it again. But she also saw the sincerity in his eyes, and for Jake's sake, she felt she had to at least give him a chance. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice cautious. "But if you do this, you have to commit. No backing out, no disappearing. He deserves better than that." Blake nodded earnestly. "You have my word." Over the next few weeks, Blake began to make an effort to see Jake, though Ruby kept their interactions limited and supervised. It started with short visits to the garage, where Blake would watch Jake work on his toy motorcycles or help Ruby with small tasks. At first, Jake was shy around Blake, unsure of how to interact with this new person who had suddenly started appearing in his life. But as time passed, the boy's natural curiosity took over. "Do you know how to fix bikes too?" Jake asked one day as Blake was watching him work. Blake chuckled and shook his head. "Not as well as your mom," he replied. "But I'm learning." Jake seemed to consider this, then handed Blake a small wrench. "Here, you can help me," he said, a shy smile spreading across his face. Blake's heart swelled at the simple gesture. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more comfortable. Blake found himself looking forward to the time he spent at the garage, not just because he was trying to reconnect with Jake, but because he was starting to feel a sense of belonging there. Ruby, meanwhile, watched the two of them carefully. She couldn't deny that Blake seemed to be making an honest effort, but there was a lingering fear that this would be temporary, that Blake would grow tired of trying to fit into a life that didn't revolve around the luxuries he was used to. She had seen this side of him before, the charm, the persistence, the ease with which he could convince people to give him what he wanted. But this time, she wasn't the one he had to win over. Jake's heart was on the line, and Ruby wasn't about to let Blake break it. One Saturday afternoon, as they were finishing up at the garage, Ruby saw an opportunity to test Blake's commitment. "Jake's got a soccer game tomorrow," she said, glancing at Blake. "He's been pretty excited about it. You should come, if you're serious about getting to know him." Blake's eyes lit up. "I'd love to," he replied without hesitation. The weeks that followed the soccer game felt like a delicate balancing act for Blake. He was slowly integrating himself into Jake's life, but the progress was incremental, and he knew he still had much to prove. Ruby remained cautiously optimistic, allowing him more time with Jake, yet always keeping a watchful eye on their interactions. She needed to be certain that Blake was serious about his role as a father before she could fully trust him. Blake did everything he could to show he was committed. He attended more of Jake's soccer games, helped with homework, and even picked him up from school a few times. Little by little, Jake seemed to be warming up to him. The boy's initial shyness had begun to fade, replaced by a growing eagerness to show Blake everything he was interested in, from his toy motorcycle collection to the little tricks he had learned on his scooter. Blake found himself cherishing these small moments. They reminded him of a simpler time, one he hadn't experienced since he was a child himself. The responsibilities of running Hudson Motors, and the pressure to maintain the company's reputation, had made him forget what it felt like to just be present in a moment. Now, he was starting to understand what he had missed out on all these years. One Saturday afternoon, while Blake was at the garage, an incident occurred that would put his commitment to the test. Ruby had stepped out for a quick errand, leaving Blake and Jake alone. Jake, as usual, was playing near the back of the shop, riding his scooter up and down the narrow strip of pavement. "Watch this," Jake called out, grinning as he prepared to attempt a little jump over a small ramp Blake had set up for him earlier. Blake looked up just in time to see Jake launch himself off the ramp, but something went wrong. Jake landed awkwardly, and the scooter wobbled beneath him before he tumbled to the ground. There was a sickening thud as he hit the pavement, followed by a sharp cry of pain. Blake's heart raced as he ran to Jake, who was clutching his knee, his face twisted in pain. Hey, it's okay, buddy," Blake said, kneeling beside him and examining the injury. There was a small scrape on Jake's knee, and his ankle was starting to swell. "You're going to be all right. Let's get you inside." Blake scooped Jake up in his arms and carried him into the garage, grabbing a first aid kit along the way. Jake was still whimpering, tears streaming down his cheeks. "It hurts," he cried, clinging to Blake's shirt. "I know, buddy. I know," Blake soothed, doing his best to calm the boy. "I'm going to fix you up, okay? Just stay still." Blake quickly cleaned the scrape on Jake's knee and wrapped an ice pack around his swollen ankle. He didn't know if the injury was serious, but he was determined to stay calm. Ruby returned just as Blake was finishing up, and when she saw Jake's tear-streaked face, her expression turned to one of alarm. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing over to them. "He took a fall off the scooter," Blake explained, his voice steady despite the anxiety gripping him. "I put some ice on his ankle, but I think it might be sprained." Ruby's gaze softened when she saw the genuine concern in Blake's eyes, and she crouched beside Jake, gently brushing his hair back. "Let me take a look," she said softly, carefully examining the injury. "We should probably get it checked out, just to be safe." Without hesitation, Blake said, "I'll drive." The ride to the urgent care clinic was tense, with Jake sitting in the back seat, still sniffling but a little calmer now that Ruby and Blake were there to comfort him. Ruby held Jake's hand, reassuring him that everything would be okay. Blake couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, wondering if he should have been more careful, if he should have been more attentive. At the clinic, the doctor examined Jake's ankle and confirmed that it was indeed a minor sprain. It would heal with some rest and care, but he would need to stay off it for a few weeks. Ruby breathed a sigh of relief, and Blake felt a weight lift off his chest. It could have been much worse. "Thank you, doctor," Ruby said as they left the clinic, holding Jake's hand. "And you too, Blake. You handled that well." Blake nodded, his expression serious. "I'm just glad he's okay." On the drive back, Jake sat quietly in the back seat, his face still pale but calm. As they pulled into the driveway of Ruby's house, he looked at Blake and said, "Thanks for helping me, Blake." Blake glanced at Ruby, who gave a small nod, then turned to Jake. "Anytime, buddy," he replied. "You're a tough little guy." After getting Jake settled inside, Ruby walked Blake to the door. "He's going to be fine," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You did good today. I could see how much you cared, and it means a lot." Blake hesitated before speaking. "I just want to be there for him," he said quietly. "For both of you, if you'll let me." Ruby looked at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said. "But I'm starting to believe that you're serious about this." Blake's heart lifted at her words. It wasn't a declaration of trust, but it was a start, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to earn a place in their lives. Over the following weeks, Blake continued to show up, not just at the garage, but also at Ruby's house, helping out whenever he could. He took Jake to his follow-up appointments, brought groceries over, and even helped around the house with small repairs. Slowly, Ruby found herself starting to rely on him more, and she couldn't deny that his presence was becoming a comfort. Yet, despite his best efforts, there was still a lingering doubt in the back of Ruby's mind. She had seen people change before, seen them make promises they couldn't keep. And while Blake had certainly stepped up in ways she hadn't expected, the question remained, would he be there when things got tough, when life wasn't about just making amends? For now, she chose to let him stay, to let him be a part of their little world. But the real test, she knew, was still to come. Blake continued to show up, day after day, slowly but surely weaving himself into the fabric of Ruby and Jake's lives. It had been a few weeks since Jake's fall, and his ankle was healing well. During that time, Blake had made a conscious effort to learn more about the world Ruby had built for herself. He spent more hours at the garage, not just watching but actively helping Ruby with repairs, gradually picking up the skills he had once dismissed as beneath him. There was a genuine satisfaction in working with his hands, a feeling of accomplishment that Blake hadn't experienced in his corporate life. It was messy and tiring, but at the end of the day, seeing the results of his labor, the sound of an engine roaring back to life or the grateful look of a satisfied customer, made it all worthwhile. And then there was Jake, who watched his every move with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. The boy's presence seemed to bring out a side of Blake that he hadn't known existed. Ruby couldn't deny that Blake's efforts had been consistent. She watched as he connected more with Jake, and she saw how Jake's eyes lit up when Blake was around. Her initial skepticism had softened, but the protective part of her couldn't be entirely silenced. She had allowed Blake to integrate himself into their lives, yet the fear of being hurt still lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, as they were wrapping up work at the garage, Ruby and Blake sat on a couple of old stools, enjoying a brief moment of quiet after a long day. Jake was in the back, playing with a toy motorcycle. "I've noticed you're getting better at fixing bikes," Ruby said, a hint of a smile in her voice. Blake chuckled. "Well, I've had a good teacher," he replied, glancing at her. "But I have to admit, I never thought I'd enjoy it this much." "Really?" Ruby asked, her tone teasing. "You don't miss the corporate world?" Blake's expression grew serious for a moment. "Honestly, not as much as I thought I would," he admitted. "Being here, working on something real, it feels different. I guess I'm starting to understand why you love this place." Ruby's smile faded as she met his gaze. "It's not just about loving what I do," she said quietly. "This garage, it saved me. When everything felt like it was falling apart, having something to focus on, something to build, it gave me a purpose." Blake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said. "I think, maybe I need something like that too." There was a moment of silence, then Ruby spoke again, her voice softer. "Blake, I have to admit, you've surprised me. I didn't think you'd stick around, let alone try this hard to be a part of Jake's life. I'm still not sure if I'm ready to fully trust you, but I'm starting to think you really mean it." Blake turned to her, his expression earnest. "I do mean it, Ruby," he said. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here now. I want to be there for Jake, and for you, if you'll let me." Ruby's gaze fell to the ground, her hands fidgeting slightly. "It's just hard," she confessed. "You left once. And I know you're trying to make up for it, but if you leave again, it won't just be me who gets hurt. It'll be Jake too." Blake reached out and gently touched her hand, a small but significant gesture. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not this time." The following weeks saw Blake becoming a more permanent fixture in Ruby and Jake's lives. He helped around the garage whenever he could and even began to contribute financially to the household, despite Ruby's initial resistance. There were nights when the three of them would sit around Ruby's small kitchen table, eating dinner together like a family. And though Ruby hadn't spoken the words aloud, Blake could feel the walls she had built around herself slowly crumbling. One evening, while they were sitting together at the kitchen table, Jake looked up from his plate and asked, "Blake, are you my dad?" The question hung in the air, freezing the room. Blake glanced at Ruby, who looked back at him with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. She had never referred to Blake as Jake's father in front of the boy, and they hadn't discussed how to handle this conversation. But it was clear that Jake had noticed the changes, had sensed the way Blake was becoming more than just a visitor. Blake took a deep breath. "Yes, Jake," he said, his voice steady but tender. "I'm your dad." Jake seemed to process this information, his brow furrowing slightly as he looked between Blake and Ruby. "Does that mean you're going to stay?" he asked, his tone innocent but filled with hope. Blake's gaze softened, and he nodded. "Yeah, buddy," he replied. "I'm here to stay." Jake's face lit up with a smile, and in that moment, Ruby felt a surge of emotions that she couldn't quite articulate. Relief, hope, and a cautious optimism mingled together, forming a fragile sense of contentment that she hadn't dared to believe was possible. After Jake had gone to bed, Ruby and Blake sat together in the living room. There was a newfound warmth between them, a quiet understanding that had settled in the aftermath of Jake's question. "I didn't expect him to ask that," Ruby admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake reached out and took her hand, holding it gently. "I didn't either," he said. "But I'm glad he did. It feels real now. Like I'm finally part of something I should have been there for all along." Ruby looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I think I'm starting to forgive you," she said, the words coming out slowly, as if she were testing them. "But it's not just about me. It's about Jake. You have to keep proving to him, and to me, that you're here for the long run." Blake's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I will," he promised. "I'll prove it every day." And as they sat there together, Ruby allowed herself to hope, for the first time in a long time, that maybe they could find a way to heal the wounds of the past and build a future together. Over the following months, life at Ruby's garage settled into a new kind of rhythm. There were still the usual ups and downs of running a business and raising a child, but there was also a sense of stability that hadn't been there before. Blake's presence had become a constant in their lives, and as time went on, Ruby found herself depending on him more, not out of necessity, but out of a genuine desire to share her life with him. Blake had taken on more responsibility at the garage, proving that his commitment went beyond just being a father to Jake. He learned the intricacies of engine repair, shadowed Ruby during her toughest jobs, and even began working with customers. The regulars took a liking to him, and Ruby couldn't help but notice the pride in Blake's eyes whenever someone complimented his work. But what Ruby appreciated most was the way Blake and Jake had bonded. Jake had fully embraced Blake's role in his life, often referring to him as Dad without hesitation. The little boy's eyes would light up every time Blake picked him up from school or cheered him on at his soccer games. There was no longer a question of whether Blake belonged. It was clear to everyone that he was an essential part of their little family. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table for dinner, Ruby glanced at Blake and felt a warmth spread through her chest. The last few months had brought them closer than she ever thought possible. There was a growing intimacy between them, built on trust and shared experiences, something far deeper than what they had before. After dinner, when Jake had gone to bed, Ruby and Blake found themselves sitting together on the porch, enjoying the quiet night. "You know," Ruby began, breaking the comfortable silence, "you've come a long way from that guy who didn't know how to use a wrench." Blake chuckled, shaking his head. "I guess I have," he said, looking at her with a mixture of humor and gratitude. "But I had a pretty great teacher." Ruby smirked, then turned serious. "Blake, I've been thinking. I never imagined we'd get here. There were so many times when I thought it would just be me and Jake forever. But you," she paused, her voice softening. "You proved me wrong. You showed me that people can change, that second chances can be real." Blake reached over and took her hand. "I didn't do it alone, Ruby. You were there every step of the way. You didn't have to let me back into your life, but you did. You gave me the chance to be a better person." She squeezed his hand gently, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't dared to feel for a long time. "And now I can't imagine doing this without you," she admitted. There was a moment of silence as Blake's eyes searched hers, and then, almost impulsively, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or uncertain, it was steady and filled with the quiet assurance of two people who had fought hard to get to where they were. When they finally pulled apart, Ruby rested her forehead against his, smiling softly. "I'm glad you came back," she whispered. "So am I," Blake replied, his voice low. "More than you know." The days that followed marked a turning point. Blake and Ruby began talking about the future, about what it would mean to continue building a life together, not just for themselves, but for Jake as well. There were practical discussions about the garage and Blake's future role in the business, but there were also moments of pure joy, like planning a family trip and talking about little renovations they could do to make the house feel more like a shared home. One Saturday, Ruby decided to put Blake's skills to the test with a project she had always wanted to tackle, a complete restoration of an old motorcycle that had been gathering dust in the back of the shop for years. It was the kind of work that required patience and precision, and Ruby knew it would be a challenge even for her. But with Blake by her side, it felt like the perfect way to mark how far they'd come. As they worked together, with Jake playing nearby, Ruby felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known she was missing. They weren't just fixing a motorcycle, they were building something together, piece by piece, just like they had built their lives. By the time they finished, the motorcycle gleamed under the garage lights, a testament to their hard work and partnership. Ruby turned to Blake, a proud smile on her face. "I'd say you've officially earned your mechanic badge," she teased. Blake grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Well, I had the best mentor," he said, echoing his earlier words. "But I think this badge belongs to the both of us." Jake ran up to them, his eyes wide with excitement. "Can I ride it?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "Not yet, buddy," Blake said, ruffling Jake's hair. "But maybe when you're a little older. For now, you can help us keep it in good shape." As the three of them stood there together, surrounded by the familiar sense of motor oil and rubber, Ruby realized that they had come full circle. The garage, which had once been a place of refuge for her, had become something much greater, a place of healing, growth, and love. It was no longer just her sanctuary, it was their home. Months later, as they rode the newly restored motorcycle down the quiet country roads, with Ruby holding tightly onto Blake's waist and Jake riding safely in a sidecar, it was clear that they were no longer just individuals trying to make sense of the past. They were a family, moving forward together, with the wind at their backs and the open road stretching out ahead of them, a new beginning full of endless possibilities. And this time, Blake knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.